What if one small decision could change your life forever? In the middle of a bustling airport, a young boy named Darren faces a choice that could cost him everything. A job interview that could save his family, or a stranger in need of help. Would you risk your future for someone you barely know? This powerful story of compassion, sacrifice, and unexpected opportunities will leave you speechless. Stay with us until the end. You won't believe how one simple act of kindness sets off a chain of events no one could have imagined. But before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. And if today's story warms your heart during this cold winter season, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming and emotional stories. Now, let's begin this journey together. The morning sunlight crept through the cracked blinds of a small, cluttered apartment on the edge of a crumbling neighborhood. Inside, Darren Brooks, a 17-year-old boy with determined eyes and worn sneakers, tightened the straps of his old backpack. The faint hum of the city outside contrasted with the quiet hum of worry inside him. The clock on the chipped wall read 8:12 a.m., and every tick sent another surge of urgency through Darren's veins. He paused for a moment at the open bedroom door, where his mother lay resting. The pale glow of dawn washed over her frail figure, and the soft wheeze of her breathing tugged at Darren's heart. Her illness had taken so much, her energy, her job, and most of their savings. Now, her treatment bills loomed like a shadow over their lives, each unpaid statement piling up on the kitchen table. "Mom," Darren whispered softly, "I'm heading out now." Her eyes fluttered open, a faint smile forming on her lips. "Good luck, sweet boy," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "You'll do great." Darren nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He had no choice but to make this day count. A job at the Brightwell Shipping Company, a rare opening for a warehouse assistant, could mean a steady paycheck. Enough to keep food on the table and maybe, just maybe, help his mom get the treatment she so desperately needed. With his breath quickening, Darren stepped into the bustling streets of East Side Haven, the neighborhood he called home his entire life. The towering skyscrapers of the city skyline loomed in the distance, a stark contrast to the graffiti-stained walls and broken sidewalks he walked past. Darren made his way toward Parkview Central Station, where the quickest train to the company's building downtown awaited. The station was always crowded, but during the morning rush hour, it became a battlefield, commuters shoulder to shoulder, eyes glued to their phones or watches, lost in their own race against time. Stepping into the station, Darren's pace quickened. His sneakers squeaked against the tile floor, and his heart thudded against his chest. Around him, the chaos of the morning crowd unfolded. People dragging suitcases, shouting over the screech of trains, and the endless shuffle of hurried footsteps. 8:37 a.m. Darren checked the cracked screen of his phone. If he made it to the right platform in the next 5 minutes, he'd still have time to reach the company office by 9:15 a.m. The interview was at 9:30 sharp. He tightened his grip on his backpack, weaving through the maze of people. "Excuse me, sorry," he muttered, slipping between a group of business people in sharp suits. The laces of his sneakers flapped loose, but he ignored them. There wasn't time to stop. Weaving through the crowd, he glanced around, the familiar chaos pulling at him. Tired workers, college students, and impatient travelers moving in every direction. He stuffed his hands into his jacket pockets, trying to tune out the blaring announcements and shrill whistle of an approaching train. The thought of his mother lying at home made his steps heavier. He didn't want to go back with nothing to show for the day. As Darren approached the main staircase, something caught his eye. Near the top, an elderly man in a faded gray coat stood motionless, his figure oddly still amid the flowing river of people. A white cane dangled loosely from his hand, more like an accessory than a guide. His head turned slightly side to side, confusion etched deeply into his face. His cloudy eyes stared into nothing, searching for something, someone. People brushed past him without a glance. A woman yanked her rolling suitcase to the side, muttering under her breath. A man in a sharp business suit frowned at the old man and sidestepped briskly, his phone glued to his ear. To them, the elderly figure was invisible, an obstacle to maneuver around. Darren slowed, narrowing his eyes. What's he doing there? He thought, his steps faltering. From where he stood, Darren could see it clearly. The man's hand trembled as he tried to place it on the rail, but he missed. Twice. Is he blind? Darren's stomach twisted. His feet stopped moving. He looked toward the platform clock. 9:07 a.m. If he missed the next train, he might be late for the interview. The hiring manager might not give him a chance at the job. Darren's breath quickened at the thought, his hands balling into fists at his sides. Darren's breath quickened at the thought, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He forced himself to look away from the old man and focused on the staircase leading to the platform. Just go, Darren. You can't waste more time. But he didn't move. The man, frail and vulnerable, remained frozen in place. A gust of air from a passing train stirred his long coat, making him look smaller, weaker. Then Darren noticed the briefcase at the man's feet, dented and old. Its handle cracked. A sudden jolt of pity hit Darren in the chest. The decision sat heavy on his shoulders. It felt like a cruel choice. Help this stranger or chase a dream that could change everything for him and his mother. The seconds ticked by louder, like a drumbeat in his ears. He took a step forward, toward the stairs, then stopped again. Darren clenched his jaw and swore under his breath. Damn it. Spinning around, he shoved through the flow of people, heading straight for the old man. A commuter bumped his shoulder hard, muttering, "Watch where you're going," but Darren ignored him, his focus fixed. When he finally reached the top of the staircase, Darren hesitated for half a second. The old man's face was more worn up close, lined with deep wrinkles that told a lifetime of stories. His cloudy eyes turned toward Darren, though they didn't really see him. "Sir?" Darren called out, his voice uncertain at first. "You okay? Do you need help?" The old man tilted his head slightly, as if trying to locate Darren's voice. "Oh," his voice was thin and shaky. "Yes, I need to get down these stairs, but I can't see so well anymore." Darren's chest tightened. "You're trying to go downstairs?" "Yes." The man nodded. "I was supposed to meet my granddaughter at the other side of the station, but everything feels so loud and blurry. I thought I could do it myself." His lips trembled, and Darren's heart sank at the sound of defeat in his voice. "Okay," Darren said, steadier this time. "I'll help you down. You don't have to trouble yourself, son," the man said softly, though relief flickered in his expression. "It's no trouble," Darren said quickly. "Come on, I've got you." He stepped closer and offered his arm. The old man hesitated before reaching out, his fingers bony and cold as they curled around Darren's sleeve. "One step at a time, okay?" Darren said gently. The two began their slow descent. Darren matched his pace to the old man's trembling steps, each one careful and deliberate. The flow of people around them split like a stream moving around a rock. Impatient groans followed them as commuters rushed past. One man clipped Darren's shoulder, muttering, "Move it already!" Darren's cheeks burned with frustration, but he bit back a retort. "Ignore them," he muttered under his breath, focused on the man's steady but slow progress. "Thank you," the old man whispered as they neared the halfway point. "You don't know how much this means to me." "It's nothing really," Darren replied, though his voice caught slightly. Out of the corner of his eye, Darren noticed a security guard at the bottom of the stairs watching them intently. The man's face was expressionless, but Darren felt the weight of his stare, sharp, suspicious. He knew that look. It was the same look teachers sometimes gave him at school, assuming he was up to no good. Darren kept his head low, ignoring it. As they reached the last step, the old man let out a shaky breath. His grip on Darren's arm loosened, though his hand still trembled. "We made it," Darren said, offering a small smile. The old man straightened up slowly, as if a weight had lifted from his shoulders. He turned toward Darren, his cloudy eyes soft. "I didn't get your name, son." "Darren," he replied quietly. The old man's lips quirked into a faint smile. "Well, Darren, you got a good heart. Not many people would stop to help an old man like me these days." Darren shrugged, glancing back at the staircase. "It's no big deal. Are you sure you're okay from here?" "Yes," the old man nodded, gripping his cane firmly this time. "I'll be fine now." Thank you, truly. Darren gave him a final nod before turning away, the knot in his chest pulling tighter as he checked his phone. 9:17 morgens. He had missed his train. The interview was in 13 minutes. Even if he sprinted to the building, there was no way he'd make it. The weight of what he'd lost pressed down on him as he walked back into the crowd. But when Darren glanced over his shoulder one last time, the old man was still standing there. His head turned in Darren's direction, his expression unreadable but warm. And despite everything, Darren couldn't shake the feeling that he'd made the right choice. Darren pushed open the heavy glass doors of Parkview Central Station, stepping into the crisp morning air. The bright sunlight, which should have been energizing, felt harsh against his skin, like it was mocking him. The noise of the city was a relentless backdrop, a constant hum of car horns, chatter, and engines. Darren glanced at the time on his cracked phone screen. 9:24 morgens. His heart sank like a stone. The interview started in 6 minutes, and he was nowhere near the Brightwell Shipping Company building. He had no idea if the manager would even consider seeing him now, but he had to try. Adjusting the straps of his backpack, Darren broke into a jog, weaving through the crowded sidewalks of downtown East Side. The towering skyscrapers seemed to stretch higher today, almost as if mocking his small, desperate form. He darted around people in suits and polished shoes, their eyes glued to their phones or the ground as they bustled forward, unaware of the boy fighting against the current of life. Excuse me, Darren shouted as he slipped between two women carrying coffee cups. One of them muttered something under her breath, her gaze sharp with irritation. Darren didn't stop. He couldn't. The weight of what he'd done was still pressing against his chest. He'd made a choice to help Mr. Clark, and he didn't regret it, not truly. But as the minutes slipped through his fingers like sand, doubt clawed at the edges of his mind. Did I ruin everything? Was it worth it? Darren pushed those thoughts down, his lungs burning as he sprinted the last few blocks to the Brightwell Shipping Company. His shoes slapped against the concrete, the soles worn thin. Finally, he reached the building, an imposing structure of steel and glass with Brightwell etched in bold letters above the entrance. Darren stumbled to a stop, panting heavily as he yanked open the front door. The lobby was cold and sleek, the type of place that made Darren feel like an outsider from the second he stepped inside. A polished marble floor stretched toward a curved reception desk, where a middle-aged woman with sharp features and neatly pinned hair sat behind a glowing computer monitor. He wiped his palms against his jeans and approached the desk quickly, trying to steady his breath. "Hi," he managed, his voice slightly shaky. "I'm here for an interview, Darren Brooks. It was for the warehouse assistant position at 9:30. I know I'm a little late." The receptionist looked up at him, her expression cool and disinterested. She gave him a brief once-over, taking in his worn-out jacket, scuffed shoes, and tired face. Darren felt small under her gaze, but he kept his head high, his hands clenched tightly into fists at his sides. "Name again?" she asked, her tone clipped. "Darren Brooks," he repeated. I just need a chance to explain." She typed something into her computer, the faint tapping of keys echoing in the quiet lobby. After a few seconds, she sighed and looked up at him. "I'm sorry, Mr. Brooks, but the interviews for this morning are already over." Darren's stomach dropped. "What? But they're over," she repeated, her tone firm this time. "The hiring manager has already left for another appointment." Darren stood frozen for a moment, as though her words had knocked the air out of his lungs. He opened his mouth, trying to find something, anything, to say. "Please," he said, his voice low and uneven. "I had a situation come up, but I'm here now. I just need 5 minutes. Please." The receptionist's expression softened slightly, but only just. She glanced at the clock on the wall, 9:34 a.m., and shook her head. "I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do. You can check the company website to see if they open another round of interviews. That's the best I can offer." Darren's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. He nodded stiffly. "Okay," he said quietly. "Thanks anyway." He turned and walked back toward the door, each step heavy and hollow. As he stepped outside, the city noise crashed over him again, louder this time, more suffocating. The rejection felt like a punch to the gut, the weight of it settling deep in his chest. For a while, Darren just stood there, staring blankly at the sidewalk. People brushed past him, their faces a blur of indifference. It was like he didn't exist. His mind flashed back to Mr. Clark, his trembling hands. The cautious way he leaned on Darren's arm as they descended the stairs. Darren remembered the gratitude in the man's voice, the wrinkled business card now tucked in his jacket pocket. "You've got a good heart, Darren." He swallowed hard, pushing the thought away. What did it matter? He was still standing here empty-handed. No interview, no job, no paycheck to bring home to his mom. The walk back home felt longer than it had that morning. Each step echoed in his ears, the worn soles of his sneakers slapping against the pavement. As the tall buildings of downtown gave way to the smaller, crumbling apartments of East Side Haven, Darren's shoulders sagged lower. The thought of seeing his mother made his chest tighten. What would he say? He had left with such hope, and now he was returning with nothing. He imagined her frail smile, the one she always put on to reassure him, even when things were at their worst. "It's okay, Darren," she'd say. "We'll figure it out." But this time it didn't feel okay. By the time Darren reached their apartment building, his head was down, and his hands were stuffed deep in his pockets. The cracked steps creaked beneath his feet as he climbed them, his legs heavy and weak. He paused at the door, taking a deep breath before pushing it open. Inside, the small living room was quiet, sunlight spilling through the thin curtains. Darren's mother sat in her usual spot on the couch, a blanket draped around her shoulders. She looked up as Darren walked in, her tired eyes lighting up with a small smile. "You're back," she said softly. "How did it go?" Darren froze in place, his heart sinking further. He tried to force a smile, but it wouldn't come. "It didn't work out," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Her smile faltered slightly, but she nodded, her expression gentle. "I'm sorry, honey." "I was late," Darren said, his voice cracking. He sank onto the edge of the couch, his shoulders hunched. There was this old man at the station. He needed help, and I couldn't just leave him there. I thought I'd still make it, but I didn't." His mother reached out, resting a hand on his arm. "You did the right thing, Darren," she said softly. "But what if it wasn't enough?" Darren whispered, his head dropping into his hands. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the faint sound of the city outside. His mother's voice broke the stillness, calm and steady. "Sometimes we don't see the good we've done right away. But it matters, Darren. I promise you, it matters." Darren nodded slowly, but the knot in his chest refused to loosen. He sat there in silence, staring at the worn carpet beneath his feet, feeling like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. Somewhere deep down, a tiny flicker of hope still lingered. The memory of Mr. Clark's kind words and the simple business card in Darren's pocket. He didn't know if it meant anything, but for now, it was all he had to hold on to. Darren sat on the edge of the old couch, staring blankly at the stained coffee table as the room around him blurred. The walls of the small apartment, usually a place of quiet comfort, now felt like they were closing in. His mother's gentle words from earlier echoed in his mind. "Sometimes we don't see the good we've done right away. But it matters, Darren. I promise you, it matters." He wanted to believe her. He really did. But all Darren could feel was the crushing weight of failure pressing against his chest. He had missed his one shot. And for what? A choice that felt right at the moment, but now seemed like a cruel twist of fate. With a sigh, Darren stood up and grabbed his tattered backpack. "I'm going out for a bit, Mom," he said, trying to keep his voice light. "Okay, sweetheart," she replied softly from her spot on the couch. "Don't stay out too long." Darren nodded before slipping out the door and into the early afternoon sun. The streets of East Side Haven felt quieter now, though the hum of city life still buzzed in the distance. Darren shoved his hands into his pockets and walked aimlessly, his thoughts a tangled mess. It wasn't until he found himself standing in front of Parkview Central Station again that Darren realized where his feet had taken him. The station loomed before him, its glass doors reflecting the bright sunlight. Darren hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, the noise of the terminal swallowing him whole once more. He didn't know why he had come back. Maybe it was a need to retrace his steps, to try and make sense of the morning. Maybe he just didn't want to go home yet, not with disappointment still sitting heavy on his shoulders. Darren wandered through the terminal, his eyes scanning the crowd as he moved. People rushed past him, their lives continuing without pause. Darren envied their direction, their purpose. He wished he could have some of that right now. Anything to make him feel less adrift. That's when he saw him. At the far end of the terminal, near a quiet seating area, Mr. Clark sat on one of the benches, his cane resting against his knee. His posture was slightly hunched, his weathered face turned toward the light streaming through the tall windows. Even from a distance, Darren could see the faint smile on the old man's face, as though he was content just to sit there and soak in the sun. Darren froze. Part of him wanted to turn around, to avoid the conversation altogether. He didn't want to be reminded of the morning, of the sacrifice that had cost him so much. But something about the old man, the way he sat there so peacefully, made Darren's feet move forward. As he approached, Mr. Clark seemed to sense him. The old man's head tilted slightly, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Ah," Mr. Clark said warmly, "I know those footsteps." Darren stopped in front of him, caught off guard by the man's memory. "Mr. Clark?" The elderly man nodded, adjusting his glasses with a trembling hand. "You're the boy who helped me earlier. I recognize your voice." He smiled up at Darren, his cloudy eyes still kind despite their unfocused gaze. "It's good to see you again, son." Darren managed a small smile, his hands still stuffed deep into his pockets. "I didn't think I'd see you here again, sir." Mr. Clark chuckled softly. "Well, life is a funny way of bringing people back together, doesn't it? I've just been resting here for a while, waiting for my granddaughter to pick me up. She's running late, as usual." Darren nodded, shifting on his feet. He wasn't sure what to say next, but Mr. Clark filled the silence for him. "How did your morning go, son? Did you make it to where you needed to be?" The question hit Darren like a punch to the gut. He looked away, his jaw tightening. "Not really," he admitted quietly. "I was late. I missed the interview." The faint smile on Mr. Clark's face faded, replaced by a look of concern. "Oh," he said softly. "I'm truly sorry to hear that." Darren shrugged, trying to play it off. "It's not your fault. I made the choice to stop and help you. I thought I'd still make it on time, but I guess I was wrong." There was a long pause. Mr. Clark studied Darren's face, his cloudy eyes seeming to see more than they should. "And you regret it?" Darren hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. Finally, he shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "I don't regret it. I don't know what to do now. That was my only chance." Mr. Clark's face softened. "You're a good young man, Darren. It takes character to put someone else before yourself, especially when you have so much on the line. Not many people would have done what you did." Darren sighed, his shoulders slumping. "But what does it matter if I can't help my mom? She's sick. I needed that job to take care of her." Mr. Clark was silent for a moment, as though considering Darren's words carefully. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out something small. "Here," Mr. Clark said, holding it out to Darren. Darren frowned, leaning closer. It was a business card, just like the one from earlier, but this time he could see the small print more clearly. Robert Clark, and beneath it, an unfamiliar company name and a phone number. "What's this?" Darren asked, taking the card. "Something you might need," Mr. Clark replied gently. "I may look like nothing but an old fool now, but there was a time when I was someone who could make a difference." His lips curled into a small smile. "Call that number tomorrow morning. Tell them I sent you." Darren stared at the card, confusion and disbelief warring on his face. "But why? You don't have to do this." "I don't," Mr. Clark agreed. "But I want to. You stopped and helped me when you didn't have to. I see something in you, Darren, something rare, and I want to help you the way others once helped me." Darren blinked, unable to find the words. He looked down at the card again, running his thumb over the smooth paper. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. Mr. Clark chuckled. "I wouldn't have given you the card if I wasn't." For the first time all day, Darren felt something shift inside him, something small but powerful. "Hope." "Thank you," Darren said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Clark patted him on the arm, his touch light but reassuring. "No need to thank me yet, son. Just make the call, and we'll see what happens." Darren nodded, slipping the card into his pocket. He didn't know who Mr. Clark really was or what this card could mean, but for the first time since the morning, he felt like he wasn't completely lost. As Darren walked back toward the terminal doors, the noise and chaos of the station seemed a little quieter somehow. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he had something to hold on to now. And for Darren, that was enough to keep going. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight crept through the thin curtains of Darren's small bedroom. The room was still and quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. Darren lay staring at the ceiling, his thoughts a jumbled mess. The weight of the previous day still sat heavy on his chest, but in his pocket, tucked safely into his worn-out jacket, was Mr. Clark's card. He pulled it out again, running his thumb over the name, Robert Clark. The number seemed almost magical in its simplicity, holding promises that Darren wasn't sure he believed. A part of him still wondered if Mr. Clark was just a kind old man who meant well, but didn't really have the power to help. But something about the way Mr. Clark had spoken stuck with him. "I want to help you the way others once helped me." Darren sat up, running a hand through his hair. He couldn't ignore it. Today he would call that number. He had nothing left to lose. By mid-morning, Darren had made his mother breakfast, 2 slices of slightly burnt toast and the last of the milk. She was sitting up in bed, the faint sunlight making her look fragile but peaceful. "You're quiet this morning," she said, giving Darren a soft smile as she nibbled on her toast. "What's on your mind?" Darren hesitated before pulling the card from his pocket and holding it out for her to see. "Remember the old man I told you about? Mr. Clark?" His mother squinted at the card, confusion crossing her face. "What's this?" "He gave it to me yesterday," Darren explained. "Said I should call the number. He made it sound like he might be able to help me. I don't know, Mom. It sounds crazy, but I can't just ignore it." She looked up at him, her tired eyes filled with cautious hope. "Then call him, Darren," she said softly. "Sometimes life surprises you when you least expect it." Darren nodded, the knot in his stomach tightening as he slipped the card back into his pocket. An hour later, Darren sat by the small table in the living room, staring at the battered old phone resting in front of him. He had already dialed the number once, only to hang up before the first ring. His hand shook slightly as he picked up the phone again. "This is stupid," he muttered to himself. "It's probably nothing." But before he could talk himself out of it, he dialed the number and pressed call. It rang once, twice. Darren held his breath. On the third ring, someone picked up. "Good morning. This is Robert Clark's office. How may I help you?" Darren blinked, startled. The voice on the other end was smooth and professional, far from what he expected. He cleared his throat awkwardly. My name's Darren Brooks. Mr. Clark gave me this number and told me to call." There was a slight pause before the voice replied, a little warmer this time. Mr. Brooks, we've been expecting your call. Please hold for a moment." "Expecting me?" Darren whispered to himself, his heart racing. Before he could process what was happening, the line clicked, and another voice came through, one he recognized instantly. "Darren," Mr. Clark said warmly. Darren sat up straight, his voice shaking slightly. "Mr. Clark? I called like you said." Good, Mr. Clark replied. "I knew you would. How are you this morning, my boy?" I'm okay, sir," Darren managed. "I don't really know what this is about, though." Mr. Clark chuckled softly. "Patience, Darren. You'll see soon enough. I've sent something your way. It should be arriving shortly. I think you'll find it rather interesting." Before Darren could ask any more questions, the line clicked off, leaving him staring at the phone in disbelief. "What does that even mean?" he muttered, running a hand through his hair. 15 minutes later, Darren's questions were answered by the deep rumble of an engine outside his window. He looked up quickly, his heart leaping into his throat. Outside, parked in front of the crumbling steps to their apartment building, was a sleek black sedan, the kind Darren had only ever seen in movies. Its tinted windows gleamed under the sunlight, and the car looked completely out of place in the worn-down neighborhood. Darren stood frozen as a tall man in a crisp black suit stepped out of the driver's side, holding an envelope in one gloved hand. "What in the world?" Darren whispered, moving toward the window to get a closer look. A sharp knock at the door made him jump. Darren's mother called faintly from her room. Darren? Who's that? I don't know, he stammered, moving cautiously to the door. He opened it slowly, only to find himself face to face with a suited driver, who gave him a polite but neutral smile. Mr. Darren Brooks? Yeah. Darren replied, feeling like he was in some kind of dream. The man held out the envelope. This is for you, courtesy of Mr. Robert Clark. Darren took the envelope with trembling hands, his throat suddenly dry. What is this? The driver tipped his head slightly. I believe you'll find the answer inside, sir. Mr. Clark sends his regards. Without another word, the driver turned and walked back toward the car, leaving Darren standing in the doorway, stunned. The sedan pulled away smoothly, disappearing down the street, but Darren barely noticed. His eyes were locked on the envelope in his hands. His name scrawled neatly across the front. Who was it? His mother's voice called faintly. I don't know, Darren said, his voice shaky. I think it's something from Mr. Clark. He stepped back into the living room, sitting down slowly at the small table. His mother peeked into the room, watching curiously as Darren carefully tore open the envelope. Inside was a letter, printed on fine paper, that felt expensive beneath his fingertips. He unfolded it and began to read. Dear Darren, I hope this letter finds you well. I've thought a great deal about the selflessness and determination you displayed when you helped me yesterday. Such qualities are rare, and I believe they should be nurtured. Therefore, I would like to offer you an internship at my company, Clark Enterprises. It may not seem like much now, but it is an opportunity to learn, grow, and build a future for yourself and your family. I see potential in you, Darren, and I hope you will accept this chance. Please meet my driver at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. He will bring you to my office for a proper introduction and orientation. Warm regards, Robert Clark. Darren stared at the letter, his hands trembling. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. Darren, his mother asked softly, what does it say? He looked up at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. Mom, it's a job. Mr. Clark is offering me a job, an internship at his company. Her eyes welled up with tears as she brought a hand to her mouth. Oh, Darren. For the first time in what felt like forever, Darren felt the weight on his chest begin to lift. The path forward wasn't clear yet, but for the first time, it felt real. It felt possible. The morning sun bathed the small apartment in a soft golden glow as Darren adjusted his collar nervously in the cracked bathroom mirror. His reflection stared back at him, a mixture of determination and doubt. His best shirt, a hand-me-down white button-up, had been ironed as flat as possible, though the cuffs were slightly frayed. He tugged on his tie, a tie that didn't quite sit right no matter how many times he adjusted it. Relax, Darren, he muttered to himself, letting out a shaky breath. Today was his first day as an intern at Clark Enterprises, and his stomach felt like a pit of butterflies. From the doorway, his mother's soft voice broke the silence. You look good, honey. You'll do great. Darren turned to see her sitting up in her bed, the faintest hint of pride in her tired smile. Thanks, Mom, he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. I'll make the most of this. I promise. She nodded, her voice gentle but firm. You've already made me proud, Darren. Just keep being yourself. He gave her a small smile, kissed her on the forehead, and grabbed his worn-out backpack. The rumble of the black sedan outside sent his pulse racing. I'll be back later, he said quickly before slipping out the door. The ride to Clark Enterprises felt like something out of a dream. Darren sat stiffly in the back of the sleek black car, his fingers drumming nervously against his knee. Through the tinted windows, he watched the world blur past, his familiar neighborhood replaced by towering glass skyscrapers, bustling crowds of professionals, and streets lined with high-end stores. When the car finally pulled up to the base of a sprawling office tower, Darren's breath caught in his throat. The building gleamed like something from another world. A security guard in a pristine uniform held the front doors open for him as he stepped out, clutching his backpack tightly. Here goes nothing, he muttered under his breath as he walked inside. The lobby of Clark Enterprises was enormous, filled with polished floors, pristine white walls, and the hum of quiet conversation. Darren's sneakers squeaked faintly against the marble as he approached the reception desk, where a smiling woman in a sharp navy suit greeted him. "Good morning," she said warmly. "You must be Darren Brooks." "Yes, ma'am," Darren replied, his voice catching slightly. "Welcome to Clark Enterprises," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Evelyn, Mr. Clark's assistant. Let me show you where you'll be starting today." Darren followed her through the sleek hallways, feeling increasingly out of place. Every corner of the office seemed immaculate. Shiny floors, glass-walled conference rooms, and employees dressed in sharp suits and heels. Darren couldn't help but feel like a fish out of water in his old clothes and scuffed shoes. He caught a few curious glances from employees as they passed, his face warming with embarrassment. "What am I even doing here?" he thought. But then he remembered his mother's smile, her words echoing in his mind. "Just keep being yourself." Evelyn finally stopped in front of a small office space tucked near the back of the main floor. Inside was a tidy desk with a computer, stacks of neatly organized folders, and a small window that overlooked the city. A young woman sat at the desk, typing away with focused precision. "Rachel," Evelyn said, "this is Darren Brooks. He'll be starting as an intern with us today. Mr. Clark thought you'd be the perfect mentor to show him the ropes." The woman turned, smiling warmly as she stood up. Rachel looked to be in her late 20s, with shoulder-length auburn hair and a sharp yet approachable demeanor. She extended her hand to Darren, who shook it nervously. "Nice to meet you, Darren," Rachel said brightly. "Welcome to the team." "Thanks," Darren replied softly, feeling his shoulders relax a little at her kind tone. Evelyn nodded approvingly. "Rachel will help you get settled in. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." "Good luck, Darren." With that, she disappeared back down the hallway, leaving Darren standing awkwardly beside Rachel. "First days are always a little intimidating," Rachel said with an understanding smile. "Don't worry, you'll get the hang of things soon enough. Come on, I'll show you what we're working on today." Rachel spent the next hour walking Darren through the basics of his tasks. She explained the company's systems, showed him how to organize data into spreadsheets, and demonstrated the proper way to file client documents. Darren listened intently, taking careful notes in a small, battered notebook he'd brought with him. At first, the sheer amount of information felt overwhelming. There were terms he didn't understand, shortcuts he'd never seen before, and tasks that seemed way out of his comfort zone. He fumbled more than once, his fingers awkwardly typing the wrong numbers or misfiling a document. Rachel noticed his frustration and leaned over with a reassuring smile. "Hey, it's okay. Everyone makes mistakes at first. Just take it slow and ask questions when you're not sure. You're doing fine." Darren nodded gratefully. "Thanks, Rachel. I just don't want to mess this up." "You won't," she replied confidently. "You're here to learn. That's what matters." Rachel's patience and encouragement made a world of difference. As the morning went on, Darren started to find a rhythm. He double-checked his work, asked questions when needed, and slowly gained confidence in what he was doing. By the time lunch rolled around, Darren had organized 2 full sets of client files and inputted the data into the system with Rachel's help. His shoulders slumped with relief as he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "You're doing great," Rachel said, dropping a neatly folded sandwich onto his desk. "Here, I figured you didn't bring lunch." Darren blinked, surprised. "Oh, thank you. You didn't have to do that." "Don't worry about it," Rachel said with a smile. "You've earned it. You're picking things up faster than most interns we've had here." Darren grinned for the first time all day, the praise making him sit up a little straighter. Really, Rachel said, taking a bite of her own sandwich. "You've got the right attitude, Darren. That's half the battle." The afternoon passed in a blur of typing, filing, and problem-solving. Rachel continued to guide Darren patiently, showing him tricks to make the tasks more manageable. Slowly but surely, Darren started to feel like he belonged, or at least like he could belong one day. When the clock finally struck 5 o'clock, Rachel leaned back in her chair with a satisfied sigh. "You survived your first day. How do you feel?" Darren exhaled, a tired but genuine smile on his face. "Like my brain's about to explode, but good. Really good." Rachel laughed. "That's how you know you're doing it right. Go home and rest. You've earned it." Tomorrow, we'll start working on some new tasks. Darren nodded as he gathered his things, his heart feeling lighter than it had in weeks. Thanks, Rachel, for everything. Don't mention it, she replied. You've got potential, Darren. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't deserve to be here. Her words echoed in his mind as he walked through the towering glass doors of Clark Enterprises and into the fading light of the evening. The same black car was waiting for him, ready to take him home. As Darren leaned back in the plush seat, his exhaustion gave way to something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, Darren believed that maybe, just maybe, he was on the right path. And no matter how hard it would be, he was determined to prove that Mr. Clark's faith in him hadn't been misplaced. The faint hum of the Clark Enterprises office greeted Darren as he walked through the gleaming glass doors on his second day. The air buzzed with an energy he hadn't noticed before. Employees moved briskly, voices murmured in quiet conversations, and keyboards clicked like a steady rhythm in the background. It was a world of purpose, and Darren was determined to find his place in it. Rachel was already waiting by his desk when he arrived, holding a fresh stack of files and flashing him a warm smile. Morning, Darren. Ready for round 2? Morning, Rachel. Darren replied with a mix of nerves and resolve. Yeah, I'm ready. Good, she said, placing the files in front of him. Today's going to be a bit tougher. We're going to move beyond basic data entry. These are actual client accounts. Don't panic. You won't mess anything up. I'll be here to guide you. Darren nodded quickly, though the knot in his stomach tightened. Got it. Rachel leaned against the desk, her tone encouraging. Remember, the first few days are always the hardest. You're learning a completely new system. Nobody expects perfection. Just stay focused, ask questions when you need to, and keep moving forward. Her words helped a little, but as Darren opened the first file and stared at the numbers, names, and unfamiliar terms, doubt crept in again. The morning passed slowly, each hour feeling heavier than the last. Darren struggled to make sense of the company's intricate database. Names of clients blended together, files disappeared when he clicked the wrong thing, and numbers refused to align no matter how hard he tried. Error 404. The screen flashed for the third time, and Darren let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing his temples. You okay over there? Rachel called gently from her desk. Yeah, Darren muttered, though his voice lacked confidence. I think I just messed up another file. Rachel stood and walked over, her heels clicking softly on the carpet. She leaned over Darren's shoulder, examining the screen. You're just in the wrong section, that's all. See this tab here? She pointed to the corner of the screen. You need to filter by active accounts instead of archived. It's a simple mistake. Darren nodded, embarrassed. Sorry. I feel like I'm messing everything up today. Hey, Rachel said, her tone firm but kind. This is what learning looks like, Darren. Mistakes are part of the process. You're doing fine. He looked up at her, doubt still lingering in his eyes. What if I'm not cut out for this? Everyone here looks like they know exactly what they're doing. Rachel crossed her arms, her expression softening. You know what you're seeing? Experience. These people didn't start out perfect either. They were where you are now. You're here because Mr. Clark sees something in you. And so do I. Give yourself time to get the hang of it. Darren nodded slowly, her words sinking in. Thanks, Rachel. I'll keep trying. That's all I ask, she said with a smile before returning to her desk. Darren took a deep breath, refocusing his attention. He followed Rachel's guidance, slowly piecing together how the system worked. The first hour felt like wading through mud, but eventually he started to understand the structure, the way client accounts were categorized, how to update notes, and where to save progress. He still made mistakes, but now they felt less like failures and more like steps toward getting better. Around noon, Darren was deep into sorting a particularly tricky client account when a familiar voice pulled him out of his focus. Hard at work, I see, Mr. Clark said warmly. Darren spun in his chair, startled to see the old man standing behind him, leaning lightly on his cane. His sharp blue eyes studied Darren with a hint of pride. Mr. Clark, Darren stammered, quickly standing up. I didn't hear you come in. Mr. Clark chuckled, waving a hand. No need to jump up, my boy. I just came by to see how you're settling in. Darren sat back down, feeling his cheeks warm. I'm trying, sir. It's a lot to learn. Mr. Clark nodded, his gaze steady. It always is at first. Nobody builds confidence overnight, Darren. I had my fair share of days like this when I was your age. You did? Darren asked, surprised. Oh, absolutely, Mr. Clark replied. There were days when I thought I'd never figure it out, days when I nearly gave up. But do you know what kept me going? Darren shook his head. The people who believed in me, Mr. Clark said, his voice soft. I see that same potential in you. You're not here by accident. You're here because I believe you can do this. Now, do you believe it? Darren swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Mr. Clark's words settle into his chest. He didn't know if he truly believed it yet, but something inside him stirred, a flicker of determination. I'll get there, sir, Darren said quietly. I promise I won't let you down. Mr. Clark smiled, his eyes twinkling. That's what I like to hear. Keep going, Darren. You're doing better than you think. With a gentle pat on Darren's shoulder, Mr. Clark turned and walked away, his cane tapping softly against the floor. Darren watched him go, feeling a newfound sense of resolve. The afternoon flew by as Darren dove back into his work with renewed focus. Each small victory, correcting a client note, properly categorizing an account, or finding a solution without Rachel's help, felt like a mountain conquered. When Rachel checked on him toward the end of the day, her smile was wide. You've made a lot of progress, Darren. Look at this. 3 full accounts sorted and logged correctly. That's impressive for someone who just started yesterday. Darren grinned, his chest swelling with pride. Really? I thought I'd barely scratched the surface. You're doing great, Rachel said. Keep this up, and you'll have this place figured out in no time. Darren sat back in his chair, a tired but satisfied smile on his face. For the first time, he felt like he belonged, like he wasn't just surviving, but actually learning, growing, and proving himself. That evening, as Darren stepped out of Clark Enterprises, the cool air hit his face, and he couldn't help but smile. The day had been tough. There were moments he wanted to give up, moments where he doubted himself, but he hadn't quit, and that felt like a victory. When the black sedan pulled up, Darren climbed in and leaned back in the seat, watching the city lights blur past the window. At home, his mother was waiting for him, as always. Her face lit up when Darren walked through the door, and he set his backpack down with a tired smile. How was today? She asked eagerly. Darren sank onto the couch beside her. It was good. Hard, but good. I'm figuring it out, Mom. She reached out, taking his hand in hers. I knew you would, Darren. You just needed someone to give you a chance. Darren looked down at their intertwined hands, feeling the warmth of her touch. Yeah, he whispered, and I'm not going to waste it. As he sat there, the flicker of hope inside him grew brighter. He wasn't just helping himself. He was building something better for both of them. And for Darren, that made every struggle worth it. The 3rd week of Darren's internship began like any other, but something about today felt different. The air inside Clark Enterprises buzzed with the usual hum of phone calls, clicking keyboards, and quiet conversations. But Darren couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was coming. He sat at his desk, laser-focused on the client report in front of him. Rachel had entrusted him with a more advanced task, analyzing account data to identify trends. At first, the jumble of numbers overwhelmed him, but with Rachel's patient explanations and Mr. Clark's encouraging visits, Darren had started to find confidence in his abilities. He now moved through the data with care, double-checking his work as he filled in the report. A soft knock on his cubicle wall snapped Darren out of his thoughts. He looked up to see Rachel standing there, her ever-present warm smile in place. But there was something more in her expression, something thoughtful, almost tender. She held a small, cream-colored envelope in her hand. Hey, Darren, Rachel said, stepping inside the small space. Can I talk to you for a second? Of course, Darren said, setting his pen down, suddenly nervous. Was something wrong? Had he made a mistake again? Rachel didn't sit. Instead, she held out the envelope. This is for you. From Mr. Clark. Darren blinked, looking between her and the envelope. For me? Why? What is it? Rachel's smile softened as she set the envelope on the desk in front of him. You'll see. Go ahead. Open it. His heart thudded in his chest as he picked up the envelope. The paper felt smooth, heavy, and professional. He carefully slid his finger under the flap, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out the contents. Inside was a neatly folded letter on high-quality stationery. Along with the letter was something that made Darren freeze, a check. He stared at it, his eyes widening as the amount registered in his mind. It wasn't just a small gift. It was a sum large enough to cover a good portion of his mother's medical bills. Darren's breath hitched in his throat as his eyes darted back to the letter. Dear Darren, over the past few weeks, I've watched you work with diligence, humility, and perseverance. You've shown qualities that are rare to find, and it reaffirms what I believed when I met you. You have the heart of someone who will achieve great things. I know about the struggles you've faced, and I want to help ease some of that burden so you can focus on building your future. Enclosed is a small gesture to assist with your mother's medical bills. Please use it well, and know that I believe in you. Keep striving forward. This is only the beginning. Warm regards, Robert Clark. Darren's fingers trembled as he finished reading, his vision blurring with tears. He stared at the check again, as if he expected it to vanish before his eyes. Rachel, who had been watching him quietly, broke the silence. Mr. Clark wanted to make sure you didn't have to carry everything on your shoulders alone. You earned this, Darren. Don't ever doubt that. Darren swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Rachel said gently. Just accept it. Mr. Clark doesn't do things lightly. He sees your potential, Darren. So do I. Darren wiped at his eyes quickly, feeling an overwhelming mix of gratitude and disbelief. I never thought anyone would care enough to help me like this. People like Mr. Clark, they don't usually notice people like me. Rachel shook her head, her tone firm but kind. That's where you're wrong, Darren. You're not invisible here. You've proven yourself. You've shown that you have the drive, the kindness, and the work ethic to go far. This is just the start. Darren nodded, though his voice was still shaky. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much. The ride home felt like a dream. Darren sat in the back of the black sedan, the envelope clutched tightly in his hand. He kept glancing at it as if to reassure himself it was real. Every turn of the car brought him closer to his mother, and the anticipation grew in his chest like a swelling wave. When the car finally pulled up to his apartment building, Darren didn't waste a second. He jumped out, ran up the stairs 2 at a time, and burst through the front door. Mom, he called, his voice echoing through the small apartment. In here, Darren, came her faint reply from the bedroom. He practically sprinted into the room, where his mother sat propped up on pillows. Her tired face broke into a smile when she saw him, though her brows furrowed in concern when she noticed his expression. Darren? What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, Mom, Darren said quickly, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement. He crossed the room and handed her the envelope with trembling hands. Read this, please. His mother frowned in confusion, but she took the letter, unfolding it carefully. Darren watched as her eyes scanned the words, widening with each passing second. When she reached the check, she froze, her hand covering her mouth. Oh, Darren, she whispered, her voice breaking. It's real, Mom, Darren said softly, kneeling beside her bed. Mr. Clark gave it to me. He said it's to help with your medical bills. You're going to get the care you need now. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she looked at Darren, her eyes full of emotion. How did this happen? Darren smiled faintly, his own tears threatening to spill over again. I helped him, Mom, at the airport. I didn't even know who he was, but I helped him, and he saw something in me. He's giving me a chance. She reached out, cupping his face with her trembling hands. I am so proud of you, Darren. Do you hear me? You didn't just help him. You changed his life as much as he's changing yours. Darren swallowed hard, leaning into her touch. I promised you, Mom. I promised I'd make things better. And now I can. This is just the beginning. I'm going to keep working hard. For you. For us. She pulled him into a tight embrace, her thin arms wrapped around his shoulders as they both cried, tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope. That night, Darren sat by his mother's bedside as she drifted off to sleep, her face peaceful in a way he hadn't seen in months. He held the letter from Mr. Clark in his hands, reading it again and again, letting the words sink into his heart. For the first time in years, Darren felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope. Real, tangible hope. He looked out the window at the stars shimmering in the night sky and whispered softly to himself, "I'm not going to waste this chance. I'll make it count." As he lay down to sleep, Darren felt a renewed purpose coursing through him. Tomorrow, he would walk into Clark Enterprises with his head held high, ready to prove that the trust placed in him was not misplaced. This wasn't just a gift, it was a second chance at life, and Darren was determined to make the most of it. The weeks turned into months, and Darren found himself thriving in ways he never thought possible. Clark Enterprises had become more than just a workplace. It felt like a second home. The sterile, intimidating office environment he once feared now buzzed with possibility. Every day brought new challenges, but Darren faced them head-on, driven by an unshakable determination to honor the trust Mr. Clark had placed in him. His desk, once filled with confusion and hesitation, was now a space of progress and efficiency. The tasks that had once felt impossible, analyzing client data, drafting reports, and managing account files, had become second nature. Darren moved through his work with confidence, his attention to detail earning praise from his colleagues and mentors alike. "Look at this," Rachel said one afternoon, holding up a report Darren had completed ahead of schedule. "Not only did you get it done early, but you caught a mistake that no one else noticed. You're making the rest of us look bad, Darren." Darren grinned, shaking his head. "I'm just trying to keep up." "Rachel, you taught me well." Rachel laughed, but her smile was filled with genuine pride. "Don't sell yourself short. You're doing more than keeping up. You're excelling. Mr. Clark was right about you." As Darren walked through the office hallways later that day, he found himself reflecting on those words. Mr. Clark was right about you. For so long, Darren had doubted himself, questioned whether he deserved the opportunities that had come his way. But now, the evidence was all around him. The completed projects, the smiles from his co-workers, the nods of approval from Rachel and Mr. Clark. Mr. Clark himself had become more than just a distant benefactor. He frequently stopped by Darren's desk to check on his progress, offering advice and sharing stories from his own humble beginnings. It was during one of these conversations that Mr. Clark shared something Darren would never forget. "You know, Darren," Mr. Clark said, leaning on his cane beside Darren's desk, "life has a funny way of rewarding people who take risks for others. Most people look out for themselves. It's the easy thing to do. But kindness, real, selfless kindness, that's rare. And it changes lives, sometimes your own, sometimes someone else's." Darren looked up from his work, his brow furrowed thoughtfully. "I wasn't thinking about any of that at the time, sir. I just saw someone who needed help." Mr. Clark smiled. "Exactly. And that's why it matters. You didn't help me because you expected anything in return. You did it because it was the right thing to do." People underestimate the power of small actions, but those are the moments that define us. Those words echoed in Darren's mind as he watched Mr. Clark walk away. It had all started with a moment of hesitation, an internal battle between Darren's desperation to get to his interview and the pull of his conscience to help a struggling old man. That single decision had set everything in motion, leading him to this point. A few weeks later, Darren stood in the conference room, presenting his first solo analysis to a group of colleagues and managers. The projector cast his carefully crafted charts and figures onto the wall as Darren explained his findings, his voice steady and clear. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment, and Darren's heart skipped a beat. Had he missed something? Did he mess up? Then the room erupted into applause. Rachel gave him an enthusiastic thumbs up, and Mr. Clark beamed with pride. "Well done, Darren," Mr. Clark said. "You've exceeded every expectation we had." Darren smiled, a wave of relief and pride washing over him. For the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged, not just in this room, but in the future he was building for himself. Later that evening, Darren sat on the worn couch in his small apartment, holding a cup of tea as his mother smiled at him from across the room. The dim light from the old lamp cast a warm glow over her face. And for the first time in years, there was no shadow of worry in her expression. "You look happier, Darren," she said softly. "I am," he replied, glancing down at his hands. "Things are finally better, Mom. We're not struggling as much anymore. And you're getting the care you need." She nodded, her eyes misty with gratitude. "It's all because of you, honey. You've worked so hard to make this happen." Darren shook his head, his voice firm. "It's because of the chances people gave me, and because I chose not to give up." He leaned back against the couch, staring out the window at the darkening city skyline. "I keep thinking about that day at the airport. I almost didn't stop to help Mr. Clark. I told myself I didn't have time, that someone else would do it. But what if I hadn't? Where would we be now?" His mother's voice broke the silence, gentle and full of wisdom. "Life has a way of testing us, Darren. It gives us moments where we have to decide who we really are. You chose kindness, and that's what set everything in motion." Darren smiled faintly, her words settling deep in his heart. "Yeah, I guess I've learned that sometimes the smallest decisions can lead to the biggest changes." Months later, as Darren stood at the window of Clark Enterprises' 12th floor office, he looked out at the bustling city below, seeing it differently than before. The streets no longer seemed like a maze he was trapped in. They were roads full of possibilities. He thought about the lessons he had learned, the value of perseverance, the importance of kindness, and the reality that success wasn't about where you started but where you chose to go. Darren knew he still had a long road ahead, but for the first time, he was excited about the journey. The door behind him opened, and Rachel stepped inside, holding a folder. "Hey, Darren. Mr. Clark asked me to pass this along. Your promotion paperwork." Darren turned, his eyes widening in surprise. "Promotion." Rachel grinned. "You've earned it. He said you're ready for more responsibility. You're moving up, Darren." Darren took the folder, his hands steady as he held it. "Thank you, Rachel, for everything." She nodded. "You earned this, Darren. Never forget that." As Darren looked back out the window, he couldn't help but smile. The future he had once feared now felt bright and full of promise. He thought about Mr. Clark, about Rachel, and about the small moment that had changed everything. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Darren made a silent promise to himself. He would keep working hard, not just for his own success, but to pay forward the kindness he had been shown. Because if there was one thing he had learned, it was this: kindness, no matter how small, can change the world. For Darren, this was only the beginning, and the doors that had once seemed locked were now wide open, waiting for him to step through. Darren's journey is a testament to the power of small actions and perseverance. It reminds us that success isn't always a straight path, and the struggles we face are opportunities in disguise. The story highlights themes of kindness, mentorship, and the importance of giving others a chance. Because sometimes, all it takes is one moment of compassion to rewrite a life. We live in a world where it's easy to overlook those who need help, to prioritize our own goals over someone else's struggles. But Darren's story challenges us to slow down, look around, and remember that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, can lead to unexpected and beautiful outcomes. In the end, Darren didn't just change his own life. He inspired others to see the value of kindness and perseverance. And that's a lesson we can all carry forward. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this story. Your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss the next heartwarming and inspiring stories we share. See you in the next story.